Good morning, colleagues. We are 1 minute away. I'm ready if you are. Thank you.
I'm ready.
Yeah, I'm also ready.
Is someone going to switch my video on?
Okay, go ahead, Prof.
Good morning, friends and colleagues. We are just waiting for more people to join us for this very exciting webinar today that is being co-hosted by the National Development Agency and the Human Sciences Research Council. So if you can just give us another minute to allow people to be allowed entry into the meeting, and then we will start. Program Director for the day. I'm guiding you through the program. My name is Professor Nania Bola-Muller, and I'm Divisional Executive of a research program at the Human Sciences Research Council called the Developmental, Capable and Ethical State. We were very fortunate to be in partnership with the National Development Agency to do the research that has culminated in this dialogue today. This dialogue is about the launch of a report and a policy brief dealing with the capacity and capabilities of civil society in South Africa. As we all know, in order to have a vibrant and healthy democracy, we need a vibrant and healthy civil society in South Africa. And civil society has been called upon, particularly in 2020, because of the lockdown and the COVID epidemic. So the importance of civil society has been stressed far more than ever before. This program, as I've mentioned, is already very packed. So we will be going through the program relatively strictly in terms of time. And this esteemed panel, they all have such long, brief biographies that it would take me about 20 minutes in total to read these biographies to you. So I can assure you that it is an esteemed panel, and I will be introducing the panel in terms of their designation. The perspectives that are offered in this dialogue today are from government, in particular the Department of Social Development, and we're very privileged to be able to hear the Minister, Lindiwe Zulu, speak. And we are also hearing perspectives from civil society itself, from communities, and also from the private sector. Because in order for us to make things work, we have to work together. So there are some rules that I would just like to share with you. So your mics will be muted and your cameras off until the discussion period. So if you want to chat, you're welcome to do so. You're also welcome to pose questions to our panel during the session. So in case you don't want, you're going to forget your question by the end when we have the official discussion session, you're very welcome to ask questions in the chat box or the Q&A box if you want to ask questions directly to the panelists, who can also answer your questions live. These questions will then also be taken into consideration during our discussion period. I'd like to inform all of you that this dialogue is being recorded and also live streamed on social media. I hope that today is going to be informative and that we're going to learn a lot about the capacities and capabilities of civil society in South Africa. This is part of a larger project where we also look at issues of transformation as well as the regulation of the sector. But without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to my Chief Executive Officer, Professor Crane Sudin, to do the welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Bola-Muller. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, and a special good morning and welcome to our Minister Lindiwe Zulu, also to our Acting DG in Social Development, Mr. Linton Mchunu. I'd also like to acknowledge the CEO of the NDA, Ms. Tamo Mzobe, and Mr. Bongani Magongo, who is the Executive Director for Research at the NDA, and all of our other colleagues who are to come. It's a great honor for us at the HSRC to be involved in this dialogue. Dialogues of this nature are a critical part of our mandate at the HSRC as a research agency in the human sciences. The intention of our dialogues is to bring all the major role players in the country together in a conversation about the key issues that we are needing to make better sense of. This dialogue is about building capacity and capability in our country. It is informed, of course, as you can hear, by the objectives of the National Development Plan. The dialogue, and I'd like to thank my colleagues at the HSRC, is led by our Developmental, Capable and Ethical State Division, a new division which we have established, headed by Professor Bola-Muller, and supported importantly by Professor Barua Kanyane, who is going to speak here to us today. I'd like to thank Barua in anticipation. The civil society sector in South Africa, as all of us know, has an absolutely critical role to play in the development questions of our country. It has an extremely illustrious history, largely because of that important role that civil society played in the apartheid era. In particular, its significant contribution during the liberation struggle. Its role in supporting victims of apartheid, its role in supporting political prisoners and their families, and the many leadership functions it played in exposing the excesses of apartheid, holding the apartheid regime accountable, and beginning to pattern out for us the outlines of what an alternative society could be. I cannot emphasize to you enough the role that these colleagues, comrades played during the 1980s, the early 1990s, and how fundamental the experience of that period of resistance was to coming to understand the ethical values and accomplishments which we need to be developing for a new society. This research which Professor Kanyana has done has come at the right time. It comes at the right time for us to be sharing the findings and the perspectives that we have in the HSRC have been able to develop on what our capacity needs are in the civil society sector, so that we can inform a response by government, but also by civil society itself and the private sector to understand better how this civil society partner can play its role. The history of the sector in this country is an example of how it can be a major force to bring about a better society. However, and this is something that we need to be acknowledging and working with critically, we made a mistake in 1994, after 1994. We essentially, and this is what we are now having to deal with, we demobilized many of our civil society structures. And this has had negative consequences for all of us. But it wasn't our own doing only. It was also because we were thinking very critically about the urgency of propping up this project of the post-apartheid era and thinking about how we could be building a new government, new institutions, new structures, which just didn't exist before. And so many of us, including myself, went into the formal institutions of the country. In those steps that we took, we largely left civil society, in a sense, to fend by itself. And in the process, and many of us have many stories to tell, our organizations, many of them struggled to survive. But yet here we are, and we are confronted with dealing with this fact that this transition, and we're still in it, is enormously complex, and that we still have a role to play as civil society structures in mobilizing our people, in organizing them in the different corners of the country in which they find themselves. So that in some ways, building this capacity of our structures outside of government is even more poignant now in some ways than it has been before. And we've seen this now as an outcome of how the pandemic has hit us. We saw how it was absolutely essential that people took responsibility for many aspects of their lives. So we have to deal with this transition. We're one of the most unequal societies in the world. We're now also having to deal with the consequences of upward mobility, in which corruption, maladministration, and inefficiency in the public sector is at an unprecedented level. No sector of society can deal with these issues on its own. And so it's really critical for civil society to be stepping up at this time in a capacitated way. So it's a very pleasing development for us in the HSRC to be working with government in taking this issue seriously, of capacitating civil society organizations to play the role they must. So our partnership with your organization, Minister, we'd like to say, we hope will go a long way in shifting the landscape to help us, all of us, in the various parts of our society in which we find ourselves, to come to understand the responsibilities that we jointly have. So in my view, this policy dialogue is absolutely critical. It is but one of a series for us to talk more and openly about our capacity and capability challenges, and to begin to think how we might, in the coming few years, as we move towards 2030, and to look at these targets and objectives that we've set ourselves with our National Development Plan, how we can all become better in taking responsibility, better in working together, and much better in thinking about how to build this new society that we are all looking forward to. So thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much, Nania, for chairing this particular seminar. Thanks, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Professor Sudin, for that welcome and introduction. As I've mentioned to you, we have the honor of being able to listen to the Minister of Social Development, Lindiwe Zulu, and she will be introduced by the Director General of Social Development, Mr. Linton Chunu, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Morning, Program Director and members of the this important engagement. Thank you for the opportunity. I will not waste a lot of time and get straight to the point in terms of my duty here this morning. I'm introducing to you the Minister of Social Development, Honorable Minister Lindiwe Zulu. She's a member of the National Executive Committee and chairperson of the African National Congress Subcommittee on International Relations. Minister Zulu was educated in Swaziland, whereupon she joined the African National Congress after the 1976 student uprising. In exile, Minister Zulu lived in Morogoro in Tanzania, where she was offered a scholarship to study journalism in Russia. She obtained a master's degree in journalism in Russian, and I've been trying to brush up on my Russian, Minister, and I have a word or two that I've managed to put into my vocabulary. Zdravuste, I think it is. And after her studies in Moscow, she joined the Liberation Army Umkhonto weSizwe once her military training was complete. Minister Zulu also joined the Pan-African Women's Organization PAWO in Angola, where she was appointed as the coordinator of the Communications Committee. And for those of us who know her, she's a very seasoned communicator. She's held several positions in that space. In '89, she was appointed the head of communication in the ANC's Department of Religious Affairs. Minister Zulu also served as the head of communications in the ANC's Uganda office. In '91, she returned to South Africa and became the head of communications in the ANC Women's League. Minister Zulu was then elected as the ANC's to the ANC's team as the spokesperson for South Africa's first democratic elections in '94. After the election, she was elected to as a member of the Gauteng legislature and was appointed the deputy speaker of the Gauteng legislature in '95. 4 years later, she was appointed the special advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and held numerous positions in the Department of Foreign Affairs. In 2003, she left government to join the private sector, where she served as the executive head of government and international relations at Vodacom Group. In '94, she became South Africa's ambassador to Brazil. She was elected to the African National Congress first in 2007, NEC rather, in 2007 and again in 2009. She was elected to Parliament as a member of Parliament representing the African National Congress. In 2009, she was appointed the special advisor to the President of South Africa on international relations. In May 2014, she was appointed as the first ever Minister of Small Business Development. In 2019, of course, she was appointed as the Minister of Social Development. Minister Zulu is particularly interested in issues relating to the promotion and protection of the rights of vulnerable groups, including women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities, amongst others. She has a passion for developmental issues and has for many years worked very closely with civil society organizations, and she firmly believes that civil society organizations are a critical element of our democracy and that of a developmental state as South Africa as we are. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you the Honorable Minister of Social Development, Honorable Minister Lindiwe Zulu. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mchunu. Unfortunately, I have been informed that Minister is not available right now. And so we will wait for her to join, but we will listen to the next presentation, which is of course central to the discussions that we're having today. And that is the introduction and overview and background of the dialogue itself, And our speaker is Mr. Mngani Magongo, the Executive Director of Research at the National Development Agency. Mr. Magongo, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Prof. Muller. And good morning, guests who have logged in to participate in this important dialogue. And good morning, Prof. Prof. Sudan, Acting DG, NDA CEO, and the Minister in absentia. Let me start by saying we are having this dialogue at a time when we are dealing with the 16 days against women and children abuse. Yesterday we had the commemoration of the AIDS Day. And the period that we are in has been ravaged by COVID. All these three things that I'm talking about, to deal with them, we need the civil society sector. Neither government nor the private sector can deal with the issues that I've just raised. We need a capable civil society sector. I think that is what I'm just wanting us to keep in mind when we talk about the topic of this particular dialogue. But to just first point out that the NDA itself, it exists to strengthen capacity of civil society organization. That's the first point. And the second point on why the NDA was created was to conduct research that encourages debates and engagement between the civil society and state organs on issues of development policy. Now, I think if we understand how we are linking this dialogue to the current state of things, just not in South Africa, but globally, and the mandate of NDA, I think we can now start to put one and one together and see where we are going. But I just want to stress a point. Prof. Crane has actually spoken about it. The NDP, part of its intention is building a capable state. It says without a capable state that can deal with the challenges that are listed in the NDP, there's no way that by 2030 we will actually achieve the goals that we want to achieve. Therefore, we actually took in 2016, we published a book called Enhancing Civil Society Participation in South African Development Agenda. The first chapter of this book, we chronologically looked at what is it that is missing within the civil society sector to perform the functions that this sector did pre-94. And there are 4 elements that came out of it. One was the capacity of the sector currently. The second one was the regulatory mechanism for the sector. The third one was resources that are needed by the sector to perform its function to its full potential. And the last one was the transformation of the sector. So that publication made us to actually want to look at this segment in detail and start to have state organs, the civil society sector itself, and the private sector to start to have a dialogue on how we rebuild the sector to its role of being the third pillar in a democratic progressive government. If that pillar doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have proper regulatory mechanism, is not transformed, neither it has no resource allocation from the state, we will have a dysfunctional civil society sector. And this has to be driven from policy level. So this engagement is a first of those 4 series of engagement that we will be having in the next coming 6 months. And we want to deal with this, and the outcome we're looking at is not just a dialogue, but we're looking for action. We're looking for action where we bring back a civil society that can deal with the things that I have said in the opening. Our current environmental challenges, not just in South Africa, but globally. And if we do not build this sector, if we do not invest in this sector, and if we don't give the space this sector requires to perform its function independently, unabated, and take the accountability, responsibility of looking after the population, our democracy will fall apart. That's the critical importance of this series of dialogue. We had made it purposefully. And I think I've said this before, that many people, they see COVID as a problem. I look at it differently. From the start, I just looked at it differently. COVID has provided us with efficient and viable option to do things better and do them bold. Today, we are sitting here having this discussion and a series of other discussions with over 100 people attending and having a debate from the range of sectors that you think without getting into complicated planning processes. So we've got to utilize them. We've got to utilize the opportunity that COVID has given and start dialogues that have got results in them. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud that today we're starting the first series of having dialogues and debate about the civil society sector. And I think we would want to take it back to its rightful position in a democratic state, and it must get the appropriate support and the appropriate policies and the appropriate environment for the sector not to be seen as a cousin of the government or the private sector, but as a partner that comes to the same table and have a rightful place in the dinner table and serve exactly the same food as the other people that are sitting in that table. I will just thank everybody who have attended, and let's have a debate. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Mr. Magongo. Your timing is immaculate. You're 1 second away from 10 minutes, so thank you for that. We are now going to listen to some interventions that are taking place, first of all by the National Development Agency, then by the Department of Social Development itself, and then some interventions by Sasa. The first presentation on interventions to strengthen civil society's organizations' capacities and capabilities is by Mrs. Tama Mzobe, sorry, excuse my pronunciation, the CEO of the National Development Agency. I hand over to you, Mrs. Mzobe.
Thank you very much to the team that has put together this dialogue session. Thank you, Program Director. I want to beat Mr. Magongo in his own game by ensuring that I take less than 10 minutes. But in essence, is that this is long overdue as far as I'm concerned. As per mandate of the NDA, this is our primary mandate to dialogue. And we are here doing just that. And I hope the outcomes and indulgence of this will take us a step further in getting things right in dealing with the issues of poverty. Thank you very much. I'll just quickly go through the slides. This is how my slides are outlined in terms of what we do, our purpose, our framework, our approach, and thus far, how far we have come, and our core areas for our interventions in terms of the program. Then I'll conclude. And I'm here to share information on the role, as the program director has summed it up nicely, to say what are the strengthening interventions that we're doing on the ground as civil society. We are mandated by Parliament, just like any other government department. And in the main, we are central and core in all related matters of poverty eradication across government departments. That's what Parliament said, to be the catalyst and the champion in contribution to the eradication of poverty and its causes. And we do this by granting funds to civil society organizations for purposes of making sure that they carry out their programs and projects of development in the poor communities. And also, which is what brought us together today in this debate, how do we strengthen their institutional capacity so that they are able to do their work in the manner that is supposed to really scale down the issues of poverty and, as we speak now, triple challenges, which is now, it's like a fourth that the mandate the pandemic has added on. This is the framework within which we do our work and within which we provide our interventions in strengthening civil society. Safe to say that, as the narrative will say and the terms will say, these are hotspots, these are pockets, these are nodal areas. In the main, our red remains the CSO mobilization. How do we mobilize the civil society organizations? We know that they were organized in the past, but they've since had a lull period because of this and that. But how do we ensure that we mobilize them for the cause that they champion in their very own communities? While we do that, then we bring the light of saying, how do we categorize them? Because for them, it's a passion that drives them. They wake up and do, they wake up and do. The compliance and governance part of it, it's not central to them. What is central is to deal with the issues that are confronting the society. So one of our duties and powers, which is mandated by the Act, is to ensure that their capacity takes them to a level where they can access any resource to enhance the work they do and to efficiently deliver in changing lives of the communities, reinforce their and their organizational support in terms of accountabilities, in terms of conflict management, in terms of financial management, and so forth. And I must tell you in this platform that it's not an easy job. When you find people, they have a vision, they've committed to the cause, and you come with this legislation, with policies, with compliance, which you just complicate the passion of them wanting to do what they do best. So capacity building models that we have, they address challenges of their weak institutional capacity. They assist the Department of Social Development in strengthening capacities of their compliance, as we know that any investor, any business or private donor is keen to see how the monies were utilized, where they benefiting, was there value for their investment. So it's where our, in the main, emerging organizations in rural areas, in semi-rural areas, in township, that they are always striving to achieve. And it's a complicated matter because most of them are illiterate. Even if they are not illiterate, the access to resources for them to comply, the barrier of having to comply in a certain language, which is acceptable by us as authorities, is one area which really makes it such a cumbersome process. One person who deals with figures is happy to deal with, I've had one workshop and tick one. With us, we're dealing with human beings, we're dealing with souls, we're dealing with skills sharpening, which is a process that takes its time in development space. So our approach, we do grant funding, we do capacity building. My main focus is income generation, your food security, your early childhood development. And we make sure that we align to the bigger scheme of things, which is the country strategy. We are within the space of NDP, we are in the space of Vision 2030, the developmental goals. So all our training capacities, our mentorship and our incubation are in line with all those prescripts and the policies and legislations that the country is pursuing. Getting to the core of what we do, the area in terms of the model that, can you move, Cry, please? In the area where we've capacitated our communities and they are showing cause, we've evolved as NDA from the 2013 where we deliberately said we want to measure the impact and the intensity within the communities that we have touched. We've managed to capacitate the 49,000, which is more than 49,000 CSOs, which were out through our interventions, were now able to account for their books, not only for Department of Social Development or government, even private and international stakeholders that invest their funds in the cause of what they champion. So this is how the spread is as per slide. So we've seen that we've evolved in terms of, by 2019, we've upscaled the intensity of our work and our footprint in terms of provinces, our footprint in terms of district, as we align to district development model as pronounced by government. We are making sure that in those pockets of areas where all the interventions are going, we are able to touch at the very, very grassroots level to account for the interventions that we invest in. Quickly taking it over. Let's move Magrai, because the slide is self-explanatory. Our core areas, like I said, these are the areas that we find ourselves in. The red one remains red with the more pressure that has been brought about by the pandemic itself, the shrinking resources globally in terms of the area of civil society being funded. It's an area that remains a worrisome for the country, not only South Africa. But we find it very strenuous in our area because the level of unemployment is raised on a daily basis. So people who are in this sector, who've been doing this work, I think the expression that they found to be central was during the pandemic, during the complete lockdown of level 5. This resource mobilization, we saw a shift in terms of those who were compliant, those who could account. We relied as a country, we relied as NDA on them to discharge and disperse their volunteers to ensure that the services, food is served in the families, the food parcels are there, those who were taking medication, who were scared to go out in healthcare centers. But these volunteers, which were championed by the civil society that we had contracted as NDA, showed the country at large that the civil society, without them, business and government are not incomplete in a democratic society. So those are the areas that we assist in: project management, conflict management, and so forth. So these are our backbone and our pillars in becoming the incubators and becoming the mentors of the emerging organization, because the capacity that we give is to ensure that there isn't an official on daily basis on the ground. However, we skill them and we strengthen them to be able to do their work on their own, even if we're not there, to be able to raise resources on their own. So I think in this space, pandemic will continue to locate the civil society, strengthened civil society, to be the champion and the core in fighting, in the forefront in fighting the pandemic. And safe to say here, even the scourge of gender-based violence as pronounced by the president, the investment that we have invested in this civil society that are driving these interventions, we're happy to say they've done so much in achieving this. So quickly in closing, I would want to say we've quite done drastically in terms of even linking them to economic opportunities for them to be able to sustain themselves beyond the capacity that we've given them, so that they can contribute to the economy of the country. And with those few words, I wish you all the best, and I'm here to indulge on the presentations that are yet to be shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam CEO. I must say that you have a very broad and very challenging mandate, and thank you for sharing with us in simple terms what the National Development Agency does and is responsible for. And yes, the money is drying up internationally and nationally for the funding of civil society, for the funding of research, and we need to ensure that we do not get into a situation where we cannot do what we need to do. And that's something that perhaps we need to think about and debate a little bit further. So thank you very much for your presentation. The next presentation is by the Department of Social Development. And this presentation is about interventions again towards the strengthening of CSOs' capacities and capabilities. And the presentation will be made by Mr. Peter Nechipale, the Deputy Director General of DSD. Mr. Nechipale.
No, thank you very much, Program Director and the CEOs of Sasa, NDA, the NDA colleagues and the professor there and our Honorable Minister. I've got a very long slides, but I'll try to fit in within the 10 minutes that has been provided for us to give you information that we have in relation to the role of social development in strengthening the capacity and the capabilities of the civil society. But I will only focus on the issues of NPOs, not civil society as a whole, as we only focus on NPO. That is the outline of the presentation. And I would like the person who is assisting me to do it quicker. The whole aim, the purpose of this is just to share information. It's going to be broad, but I will start it from the contextual overview up to the interventions that we do. Next slide. From the point of the department, we administer the NPR Act. And this act came into operation in 1998 on the 1st of September. And the act was promulgated to repeal certain section of the Fundraising Act of 1978 that were very prohibitive, that were not developmental, and that prohibit other people to establish, to be recognized as an association. And this act also entrenches Chapter 2, the Bill of Rights, Section 18 of that, which states that each person must have freedom of association, and therefore this find its way into the entrenching that on the Constitution. The legislative mandate, the next slide, the legislative mandate that we have is the department has got the mandate to administer the NPO Act, which is part and parcel of the civil society that we are talking about, and it provide a facility for everyone who wants to be recognized as a legal entity to register. The purpose of the act, one is to provide a registration facility for organizations, and the other ones is to ensure that it prescribes to those organizations that once you are registered, you need to adhere to certain principles so that what you do has got the public trust and promoted that what you are doing is enhanced by the law. Let's go to the next slide. I think you must, next slide, jump this slide, go to the next one. The mandate of the department in terms of the provision of capabilities and the capacities, especially the NPOs, relates to Section 5 of the NPO Act. That states that the department is responsible for facilitating the process of developing policies, programs to support the NPOs before they register, once they register, or wherever they need assistance. And I think this context, I will also bring it forth when I go to the specific areas where we deal with. Maybe what we should deal with is to go to the next slide, which says that the department has got a responsibility towards NPOs as a regulator and an enabler for the sector to be able to thrive. One, as a regulator, is that you are registered, but you must comply in terms of sections of the NPO Act. Once you do that, then we need to make sure that it enables you to be able to deal with all that you are supposed to do as an NPO, as registered. Now that you belong and you are controlled by the Act, it will be mandatory for you to deal with. Maybe what we need to do is to look at what is that I'm talking about when I'm talking about the NPO. Next slide. In the country today, this slide for you, you can see, I can see here, you can see what I have. We have currently over 233,939 NPO registered on the database. And if you look at the right, the majority of those, 91% of those NPO registered are voluntary association. What does it mean? It's a community-based organization that registers to become an NPO. 8% of those are non-profit companies. They need to also register with NPO Act so that they become a public benefit organization. The 1% is about the trust. Trusts are registered by the Magister in terms of the Magister Act, and the company in terms of the Companies Act, but all those, they also register to become a non-profit organization. Then they are regulated also by the NPO Act. Next slide. The registration of NPOs is varied. You don't register just for everything. You register based on the UN classification that classifies a non-profit organization either for social services, either for business or culture, creation, etc., etc. And those categorization gives us a broader platform in the country to be able to say what type of NPOs we have. Next slide. The next slide. Go to the next slide. The next one. The next slide show us the number of NPO registered per, go back one slide. This slide show us the number of NPO that are registered in the country per province. And also we also provided for you, and especially for issues of capabilities and capabilities, capacities and capabilities, that we stand due to COVID-19, 63% of those NPO that are registered are not compliant, fully compliant. And I think it's because we were closed and they were unable to deal with that. Next slide. If you look at the next slide, you will realize that the majority of the NPO that are registered, they are social services, which is that 37% that I've mentioned, followed by the development and housing. That was the number of NPOs that are registered. And then religion, some of the churches, they register with us. The next slide that we have is that we need to then say, as a department, what programs do we have to ensure that this number of NPOs that are registered are catered for? Next slide. The next slide, because I've got just 4 minutes left, I will just indicate to you that one of the things that the department does is to provide some capacities in terms of the NPO Act. Section 12 of the NPO Act mandate us to register an NPO. And in so doing, we provide them with a license to practice that comes with responsibility that says, now you are registered, you have got an increased opportunity to get funding, like the CEO of NDA has mentioned. You are credible and you are a reliable organization. Section 18 also provides that we must implement compliance drives. We provide programs, some of the capacities, the road shows that we have, the Know Your Status campaign, to educate them that they must comply because they are supposed to comply back. Section 25 mandate us to keep a credible register and to always inform those that are registered that they are supposed to behave in a certain way, and they must comply to us. Next slide. Section 5, B1 and 2. It mandated us that you must develop the codes of good practice, that NPOs need to use those codes as part of the capacity that we need to be given. We must also develop governance guidelines and also ensure that the NPO officers that are governing the NPOs are empowered and are acting in accordance with the Act. Section 17 of the NPO Act says that we need to conduct workshops and we need to ensure that all registered NPOs are capacitated or are given some form of information and awareness on their roles and responsibility. The next slide tells us on section 2E that we need also, I think earlier I've mentioned that the Act prescribes that we, in collaboration with other government departments and sectors, we will facilitate some partnership with other partners to assist with the issue of capacity building, either in financial management or in the compliance or in service delivery or in what the NDA has been providing, project management and others. And also collaborate with the intelligence centers on the issues of anti-terrorism, anti-money laundering that needs to be done. So the role of the department is broadly to look at the Act and its sections and ensure that the NPOs are capacitated or provide capabilities in order for them to be able to thrive. What are the future plans as I conclude is that as a department, and the Act prescribes that we must work with other government departments. You have seen that NPO register with different types of NPOs register here to the regulator. But then different departments and entities need to deal with their own NPOs and provide capacity on what they're doing. What are the future plans in terms of programs for capacities and capabilities? Is to strengthen collaboration and mobilize resources across all sectors, private, donors, and government department, and also to enhance the implementation of NPO sector engagement programs, and also look at the legislation that will need to provide us so that whatever we do, we are covered, and it empowers and create an enabling environment for this sector to thrive and for this sector to act accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for, again, a very informative presentation. And we have some very specific questions coming through to the panel about issues on timing and contact with the department and so on. And so I would appreciate it if we could perhaps answer some of those more practical questions as we go, because we would want to have a little bit more of a debate afterwards. So the next presentation is from Sasa, Ms. Diane Dunkley, the Executive Manager of Grants at Sasa, who will now be talking about what Sasa does to strengthen CEOs' capacities and capabilities. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all the delegates, to the CEOs, and to the fellow panelists. I'm going to present on Sasa's interventions, but really just to focus on what Sasa does and how we use the civil society organizations rather than what we do to strengthen their capabilities. And I think it'll become clear as we move through the presentation. If we start off, and sorry, if we can just continue. What I wanted to do is to just put out the facts about what Sasa does and how we contribute to the portfolio, which includes social development and the National Development Agency. If we can go to the next slide, please. This just is a fact sheet on Sasa. And I think the things that I wanted to just focus on here very briefly is that we're a Schedule 3A public entity that focuses specifically on the provision of social assistance. In doing that, we contribute to the NDP Outcome 13, which talks to an inclusive and responsive social security system. I'm not going to go through all the details, but I think what is important to note is that through the income transfers that we're responsible for, we support approximately 32% of the South African population with grants. And that is the population that is supported through our longer term grants. If we add the short-term relief grant, which has just been introduced to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, then there are nearly 50% of the South African population that is dependent on the income support that is provided through Sasa. If we move on, specifically to the Sasa mandate, our mandate is very clearly to provide the administration and the payment of social assistance. As we look forward, it is then to start seeing how we can broaden our mandate or our administration and payment to include social security, which includes the contributory schemes as well. We are not there yet, so Sasa at this stage really focuses on social assistance, which is the non-contributory income support that is provided to people who qualify. The people that we directly provide services to are older persons, people with disabilities, and children. Those are our direct customers. Obviously, we deal with a number of other people within the communities, but those certainly are the direct customers. If we can move on. If we just look at the South African social security system, and it comprises of 3 pillars, and SASA is squarely put into pillar 1, which is the non-contributory grants, and we've listed the grants that we administer and pay there. Pillar 2 is the contributory funds, and this is included in the Social Security Agency Act, but as a prospective way forward, and we're starting to look at how do we as government start bringing all of these under one umbrella, not to say that they would necessarily be under SASA's umbrella, but under a single umbrella where there is a lot more coordination. And then pillar 3 is the voluntary and the contributory schemes where people choose to belong depending on their financial circumstances and so on. So it is not compulsory at this stage, but I know there is work that is being done to start looking at making a compulsory national social security fund in the future where everybody would be expected to contribute, and that would make sure that there is certainly provision for people to cushion the shocks of unemployment or illness or old age, and not just necessarily rely completely on the non-contributory schemes that are indicated under pillar 1. If we look then on the next slide at the social assistance program, and we all know that it is the largest anti-poverty or the poverty alleviation program within South Africa. It reaches, as I said, currently about 32% of the population. We currently pay 18.5 million social grants every month, and these are the longer term grants. Added to that, in terms of the social relief grant that has been introduced, there is another 6.5 million people that are benefiting from that short-term grant that has been introduced to negate the impact of the pandemic. As I said, the people that we really focus on are children aged from birth to 18 years of age, older people over the age of 60, and then people with disabilities. One of the big gaps in the social assistance program is certainly people of working age, that is between 18 and 59, who do not have disabilities. And these are largely the ones that have been picked up through the short-term relief grant that has been introduced. Now, with that as the background and understanding the mandate of SASA, if we can move on, we as SASA then started looking at what opportunities exist for us to engage with civil society organizations. If we can move to the next slide, please. Where we say, if you look at the mandate that I've highlighted, that we don't have a direct mandate, unlike the NDA and social development, to contribute to the capacitation or the growth of civil society organizations, but certainly do see the value and the important role that the civil society organizations have to play within the social assistance environment. And this extends from being the voice of the people on the ground, monitoring our services, providing sometimes very valuable feedback, sometimes feedback that's not always nice to hear, but is really, really critical if we're serious about improving our service delivery engines, if we really make sure that we are able to meet the mandate that we've been given. So we depend really and really welcome the opportunities for engagement with the civil society organizations. And some of the specific engagements that we currently have as SASA with civil society organizations, if we can move on. The first one is around the citizen-based monitoring, which is done by some of the organizations in conjunction with the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in the Presidency. And this program does monitoring at SASA local offices, at our pay points, at various service points. And what is intended by this is to make sure that the services that are provided are in line with our customer care charter. They are in line with the requirements of government in terms of putting our customers first, and that the feedback we get really is used to improve our service deliveries, to inform our service delivery improvement programs, very often targeted to specific areas of non-compliance. If we then look at the next slide around the other engagements we have, we at SASA have a civil society organization forum which is a regular engagement with various civil society organizations to look at what is happening in the social assistance environment. We look at complaints that come from community members around various services that are provided, some of those being the funeral policy deductions, which really do create a challenge, and it's important to get feedback on those. But it's just as important to get feedback on the general services that we provide, where it relates to people being able to access, first of all, services, to lodge applications, to be able to appeal against decisions that are made, to get feedback on how the social grant payments are going and what we can do to improve access there. And the forum is an active forum, and we do include our other partners as well. So included in this forum is both the Department of Social Development. We also include the Post Office as our payment partner, and then Black Sash and their affiliated partners as the civil society organizations that we work with. This forum has really been incredibly valuable in terms of getting honest feedback on services that are provided by SASA. Then specific, if we go to the next slide, specific to this period around the pandemic, we really benefited hugely from the work that was done through NDA in terms of recruiting volunteers. And these volunteers were provided to SASA to assist in a number of critical areas, including queue marshalling and making sure that our clients standing in the queues maintain social distancing, that we really didn't contribute to the spread of the virus. And the volunteers were incredibly helpful here, despite the fact that we were not able to necessarily be at all of the access points all the time, but where we were, they certainly added huge value. And then the other very important role that the volunteers played was to assist community members who either didn't have access to technology or were not familiar with using technology to be able to lodge applications for the special relief grant. And this really was incredibly helpful. And because of this, we've really seen that volunteers have an important role to play. And as SASA, we're looking at how we would be able to institutionalize this, institutionalize a volunteer program within the services that we provide. One of the really important functions that we have to do is to reach out to communities, not just to wait for people to come to us to lodge applications and so on, but really to reach out to communities, perhaps where we don't have a permanent office, where we can only go there occasionally, or where there are other challenges with the communities accessing our services. So we would be looking at how do we strengthen our outreach program through the use of volunteers. There are a number of issues that would need to be dealt with there, and some of these we would deal with as a portfolio together with the NDA. Because you'd need to look at issues of stipends for volunteers. It is fine to appeal to volunteerism, but there are practical realities, including the fact that how do you get the volunteers to be where they are most needed? So those are some of the practical areas that we are still looking at. And then obviously to make sure that there is clarity in terms of the roles within the portfolio, so that volunteers know who they are being managed by, who they report to, what their responsibilities are, and constantly to get feedback in terms of the value that they add to the different programs of government. And I think it was said a lot earlier that the problems and the challenges in our communities are certainly not challenges that can be addressed but through government alone. We really rely on civil society organizations and look forward to continuing the relationship we have with them and certainly growing and expanding that relationship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane, for that presentation. Again, enormous amount of information in a short period of time. But we will engage with it further, and there are quite a number of questions that are being posted to the panelists. And I would please request you to answer some of those questions live as we go. In other words, just type answers to some of the questions so that we can deal with some of the more substantive questions during the discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, Professor Modiwa Barua Kanyani. I like to say his first name because he's taught me how to do that. Professor Kanyani is a strategic lead in our division, the Developmental, Capable and Ethical State, and he led this part of the project with the National Development Agency. So Professor Kanyani will now present the findings of the research that we did. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Nania, Professor Bulamola. Indeed, as you have rightly put, that this study was conducted, and I want to take this moment to also thank our CEO and the Minister in absentia, but more importantly, to appreciate the members of the team, Dr. Paul Platinka, Mr. Ngapeli Chunu, as well as Dr. Gregory Hoston, and more to appreciate the coordination role played by Advocate Gary Pinar to put us together so that the communication flow concisely and effectively between the HSRC and the NDA. And this study could not have happened without also the support from the NDA. And I want to move to the next slides to talk briefly about the background of this study, creating capacities and capabilities. And I think the background and the interventions that we have been hearing this morning from Sasa and the NDA, and it brings us to close realities on the ground, because this study is more not for the researchers to talk on behalf of what we have found, but we're going to be direct just for us to have a clearer understanding of what these civil society organizations are going through, and at the same time, the dynamics that Professor Crenshaw-Dean has put, the landscape of apartheid and the demobilization of the civil society at the time, and where we are. It is a clock that is ticking to appreciate that now we are coming, all of us, to address this situation in the civil society sector. And I think that is what this research is all about, and to provide the necessary recommendations. And looking at also the objectives of the study, which I'll put across. And this more in particularly, we will be looking at the findings and also what could be the possible recommendations. The next slide, as I put into context, we were given specific role to play as the researchers, and this objective has been identified by the NDA so that we should be focused. And our focus of the study is basically to identify the key capacity and capacity challenges that are experienced by the civil society organization, and to also determine most appropriate mechanisms that should able to capacitate the sector to overcome these challenges, and what could be the interventions. We have heard about the interventions, but what could be other interventions that should be brought forward? And as we look at this, we are now going to zoom into the methodological approach of the study. Next slide. So given the comprehensive approach and the dynamics at play in the civil societies, we decided to follow through what we call a qualitative method, so that it should become a first phase as now going to probe deeper into the whole landscape of the civil society organization. And that's why we then look at the review of the significant studies which were conducted regionally and internationally, but also reflecting on type of the work that has been produced by the government. So trying to do this review of also understanding the legal or regulatory requirements of this as is part of other two studies, as Professor Nania have indicated that this is part one of the studies. There are 3 studies that are running, that were running parallel. So now when we look at this, but we could not isolate ourselves only to the desktop or documentary review, both regionally and internationally, but we added what we call an empirical voice, just to have a sense of the voices coming from the key respondents. And the key respondents here mostly are the civil society organizations who are in the forefront of the leadership of these organizations. So they know it better to experience this on a day-to-day basis. So engaging with them provided that empirical voice that added value to this research. And so from the civil society, we also engage with the government and aspects, and that give us now a complete picture. And I want to move to the next slide. The next slide. So looking at this research framework, we then have to put together some questions that can direct this discussion on creating capacity for the civil society. So we then have to understand what is civil society, because as you can understand that when you go into the civil society sector, you will come across the NPOs, that typology of the civil society, the NPOs, the CBOs, and on all of this, and we tried to provide a classification in terms of their roles, in terms of their type, and in terms of their category. And this is critical because they then link to their regulatory framework. So civil society is defined as a sphere of society which exists independently of government and the private sector. So it is sort of a non-state player that add value to the provision of the service. So the government cannot, it's not a standalone to provide services. We have civil society organizations that are standing, and I'm very pleased that there's an intentional support to make them to thrive, because they add value, a complement in the whole landscape of service delivery. So civil society organizations differ significantly, as I've explained, in terms of their typology. Some play critical roles in the space of as trade unions, some as professional, faith-based organizations, social movement advocacies, some championing on strengthening the social accountability against the ethical dilemmas that are prevailing in the country. So they play different type of roles, and therefore they must be looked from not from a homogeneous context, but from a heterogeneous context, so that when we approach them, it's not providing a one-size-fits-all intervention. Next slide. Now I'm going to just take you into the findings. We have a bulky report, and I encourage you, this report it will be made available just to go into it, because this slide is just taking or teasing out critical issues, but there are also context that is put there in the report. And as you read it, you're able to go through this maze of challenges of capacity and capability situation that is confronting the civil society sector. So in terms of the desktop, we then realized that there are internal capacity constraints, and which relates to the vision and the mission, just the simple soft issues of the vision and the mission, the leadership, the management, the structures and the procedures. Those are critical issues that one will then have to look at them and what it presents. And hearing from the empirical voice, they are saying the capacity within this civil society sector is limited. And I think this is an underlying factor that cuts across, that we have constraints in the capacity. And more importantly, one said that, I mean, if you think about keeping the company afloat, that includes fundraising, attracting investment. And many organizations, they lack that mobilization of resources to keep their organization afloat. So that is in itself is a challenge. The funding as a critical player in capacity building has been recognized as a challenge. And the CBOs lack resource organization skills, the content-specific skills in various fields of work. So these are soft skills like HR, financial management, and leadership that resonate with what the international and the local literature is saying. Next slide. Still on the capacity and capability challenges, now we zoom to the external. What I've said was the internal challenges. And looking at the external challenges, these include the legal framework, socio-economic factors, as we have already alluded to, the political environment of the time that we are exposed to, the societal norms. They compound the complexity of the civil society. And these are the challenges which are external. And when they are compounding this civil society, that they constrain this capacity. The government becomes a burden. And this is the voice of one of the key informant. And we, because of the protecting their integrity, we have anonymized them. And they are saying that often when you access this funding, there are some reporting protocols, which often become very complicated because the government want to make sure that there's a monitoring and evaluation, a system flow of reporting to make sure that when you are funded, there's that reporting. But they see it as a complexity that adds to a complex environment of accessing this fund. Everyone is there for themselves to push a particular agenda. Hence, you find that most of these organizations end up getting swallowed by the bigger ones who can attract the funding. So what this key informant is saying is that those other individual civil society organizations which have the capacity for resource mobilization, they stand out with their investment and donor support, and they get the other little ones, they get swallowed along the way, and as a result, they cannot prevail. So the other issue is around the issues of accreditation, because often, of course, these capacity building programs may not necessarily be accredited, but some could be very useful for skills enhancement to make sure that there's a control around them about accreditation. But of course, they lament the fact that this is accreditation process in itself is a complicated process to follow, and it requires some payment of the training of these service providers. And one said, we have tried it, but we have stumbled over the fact that we should need to pay the guy so much to develop the manual, and that adds value to the little resources that they have. Next slide. So now looking at all of these issues, zooming on this, I think I've already raised them, the internal and external challenges around leadership and stuff, and I will not take more time on this. And I want us to go to the next slides, please. Yes. So now, in terms of the mechanisms to capacitate the civil society organization, the literature review tell us that the mechanism for capacity building may aim at building the capacity of individual organization or the broader society. So the key informants are saying capacity talk to all the necessary resources that are required for an organization to run. So that I understand capacity to mean the intrinsic and the extrinsic values. So capacity in itself has been understood by the civil society, and it's not something that is complicated to them to understand. But what becomes critical is the mechanisms for providing those necessary interventions. The next slides. And one key respondent says, we have struggled with, for instance, we have not been able to get money from government to employ social workers. For us, we talk about capacity building. We focus more on the use of technology. And I think that's very important, especially when we are talking in this era of the fourth industrial revolution, to create some business intelligence solutions, and also the emotional intelligence that is needed for leaders in a context of South Africa. The next slides. In terms of the skills transfer, they put emphasis there that the private sector, besides the government's role in the capacity support, the private sector or the corporate have such a responsibility to provide a kind of support for the NPOs in terms of the skills that they can able to unleash, so that they can provide the training and development for the NPOs, not necessarily in terms of funding, but they can take their skills in the private sector and utilize them to empower the civil society. So the mentorship support is also identified as a critical, so that we can able to provide the content specialists to support the civil societies. And this is very important. The other one that is very invaluable is the learning exchanges, and that is emphasis of the peer learning, so which is very critical. The next slide. This is the last slide on the mechanism to capacitate the civil society, being able to harness and nurture those skills, including people management. So these are soft skills, really. The people management is probably important in the sense that you do not want people who come and go. So now many key informants emphasize that we need to have a job retainment in those civil societies, so that they should not have a high turnover of the skills which they have tried with a lot of resources to empower them, but at the end of the day, they leave the civil society for greener pastures. So there must be intentional way of retaining these skills and stay in the civil society organizations. Next slide. Now coming to interventions to sustain capacity organization, being able to harness and nurture those skills, including people management, is probably important in the sense that you do not want people to come and go. I think I've looked at this. Can you go to the next slide? Yes. So on this part, we then talk about what the key informants refer to as a skills development levy that needs to always be utilized to stimulate the funding support that is sustainable. So the skill development levy is a critical, important resource mobilization to sustain the capacity and capabilities of this sector. And I think we, in close quote, I think we need that coordination structure that is comprising of civil society, government, and the private sector, which will ensure that the service providers appointed will be agreed to have a buy-in. And I think we will be doing away with fragmented approach if we utilize skill development levy approach. And I think the issue around peer review is important when you have civil society organizations that are operating within a particular sector. So that peer review is very important. And I want to now draw to some recommendations. Can you go to the next slide? All right, before the recommendation, this is perhaps the one slide to reflect. So in terms of the literature, yeah, the private sector and stay there. The government should provide financial resources to enable civil society to do their work and create an enabling policy framework for the civil society. So this is very important to ensure that we have a seamless approach on the policy framework. You need a structure that supports the smaller struggling organization, whether through formal and informal training programs or peer review of these programs. And I think the role of the government is to oversee the development guidelines of what is expected. So the role of the government should play a sort of an oversight role, not necessarily interfere in the operations of the civil society. And that is in agreement with what the literature review is saying. The next slide. Again, next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of the recommendations, we have two sets of recommendations. The first recommendation is about the capacity and capabilities. And then the next one is about the sustainability. And this is the last slides to present. So government should assist in the expansion of the civil society, tailor-made training on topics related to leadership, financial management, conflict resolution, fundraising, and reporting. These cut across in all the findings that we come across, that the soft skills of leadership, financial management, conflict resolution need to be paid attention to. And again, the emphasis on the public-private partnerships is very important to sustain the civil society sector. The other recommendation is more on the civil society forums, that they need civil society forums that are vibrant, robust, so that they can able to engage with each other and lead this process of capacity process in a very structured approach. And this civil society forums is very important. The government should encourage mentoring and peer learning, and take note of this is coming many times, the mentoring support and the peer learning based models that need to be introduced. And the other component is the wider base of the small civil society in shaping the direction of the capacity building sector. What we also found and received as a very important contribution to the civil society sector is when the key informants are saying that the government should consider establishing an ombudsman for civil society to handle complaints and to identify necessary intervention. So they want to move that oversight role to an independent body called an ombudsman so that it can handle their complaints. And this, what comes is my last slides as I draw to the end. Government should develop civil society regulatory framework. You'll be able to see this in the next segment of our research on the regulatory framework. And then the government should encourage the private sector to have a corporate social responsibility budget dedicated to the funding of the civil society sector. So this private sector should play a role with that corporate social responsibility budget. And the government should also provide a review on how funding is allocated to the civil society. So that review need to follow through so that there must be a seamless way of understanding how this allocation is given so that no one is left behind. And the government should ensure every ministry has a set of corresponding civil society organization support. So the government department must mainstream civil society support. Every ministry must play a critical role in supporting the sector, not only the Department of Social Development and few ministries. And government should promote the SETA skills levy that we have talked about. And lastly, government should find ways to encourage development of a stronger philanthropic spirit. And I think this is very important, that a philanthropic spirit must be planted as a powerful spirit to engineer the understanding of the role that is played by the civil society as a critical component of the landscape of government intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barua, for that presentation. It was a big project, and it's difficult to put all of that in a few slides. So hopefully we've managed to bring across the main research findings, and that this informs the discussion going forward. So up until now, we've been hearing about how government and its agencies are strengthening the civil society. Now we're going to hear some other perspectives that are also related to the research. So the next presentation is by Mr. Chippa Sitole, the National Coordinator for the Alliance of NPO Networks, to look at the perspectives of NPOs. I'm going to hand over to you, Mr. Sitole.
Thank you, Program Director. I must also give thanks to the NDA and HSRC for inviting us to share our own perspectives as the NPO sector. And also say thanks to the Minister in absentia and to the fellow panelists. Good morning. The purpose of our presentation or contribution to the dialogue is also very much to acknowledge the research that has been done and also the report that was just given to us instantly, and to build on that moving forward. It is important as well that we say that the skills and the knowledge that we need to strengthen the outcomes of our performance as a sector has changed over time, but we must also acknowledge that the methods to build those capabilities remain unaffected. There might have been some changes lately, but in totality, those remain unaffected. And as a sector, we must put capacity and capability building at the top of our priority list. And we must also focus on sustaining skills and learning. We also need to develop processes of enabling those living in poverty to develop skills and competence, knowledge, structures, and strength, so as to become more strongly involved in their own communities and to be able to take control of their own lives. And this includes, in many respects, the beneficiaries of our own projects. The next slide, please. The Alliance of NPO networks is a relatively young organization that was just formed early this year. But in a nutshell, our programs of practice ensures development and promotion of capacity building efforts that would lead to increased equity and outcomes for our constituencies as well as our beneficiaries. The next slide, please. Our approach, the next slide. Our approach, we approach our work as a sector by remaining inquisitive and being transparent, equitable, and accountable to the non-profit organizations and communities mostly impacted by our capacity building efforts. Slide number 5, please. In the context of the Alliance, our advocacy themes or issues are designed in such a way that they create or they mean to change the policies, the laws, the regulations, the distribution of resources, or other decisions that could have an effect on the development and sustainability of the non-profit sector, as well as people's lives, and to ensure that such decisions lead to implementation. The next slide, please. The introduction to the subject matter today, I think most of the panelists before me have articulated on this, but it is also important that we give you the perspective from the NPOs about the NPOs. So it is also important to note that there has always been a saying that, that there's nothing for us without us. So the contribution on the perspective from the NPOs about the NPOs is also very much encouraging. One of the important roles that we play as a sector is to support government in fulfilling its statutory obligations. And the National Development Plan, the report of 2011, also states that all the provinces in South Africa rely heavily, I must emphasize on that, they rely heavily on the NPOs to deliver services. The next slide, please. Slide number 8. We've moved to that one. The next one, please. South Africa no longer regarded as a priority for donor funding, and that is a challenge. And most of us as the sector, we've relied on funding from the government and the international community to ensure our sustainability. But in the absence of ensuring that we create our own kind of funding that can sustain us in the absence of government or international community. And according to available data, we continue to be reliant on funding and especially subsidies from the state. And it appears also that the agencies that were set up to contribute to the sustainability of the sector, the NDA and the NLDTF, are also not able to cope with the high demand made by the NPOs on their funds. So it is also very much critical as the sector to develop ways and means of creating investment vehicles that would ensure sustainability in the absence of external funding. The next slide, please. We also looking at the fragmented state of the civil society movement as a whole, and particularly the NPOs, or your community-based organization networks. I mean, organizations that are actually about between 70 to 80% of those that are registered with DSD. And the objective here is to create an enabling environment for civil society advocacy and campaigning in the country. And our campaigning will be making policy processes more effective and inclusive, and as well as by bringing in different perspectives. You know, NPOs will provide decision makers with access to valuable insights. And we will also bring expert knowledge and robust evidence that can be used to improve public policy and the delivery of much needed services. The lack of sustainable development centered programs also impact on the sustainability of the sector. And research has identified that the availability of funds, quality material resources, supportive leadership, development of needs-based and demand-driven programs, and effective management can have a significant influence on the sustainability of local NGOs. Significantly, leadership appears as the most important factor to organizational sustainability of NPOs. It is also suggested that we can adopt several measures to ensure our sustainability, which include the writing of good needs-based and demand-driven project proposals, ensuring transparency and accountability, leadership training, and lobbying, of course, for resources, including funds, especially from local sources. The next slide. Okay, don't move from that one. The politicization of the sector, the last speaker, Prof, has alluded to this, and it is, you know, very shocking that we're still facing more and more political scrutiny from our own country leaders and leading political parties. We must not hide that. We must be very frank about it. But this does not seem to be a two-way process in the main. And quite rightly, most NPOs have values and policies that excludes individuals and organizations promoting or getting involved in party politics. However, it seems that most of us have taken that to mean we have no role or responsibility in the broader day-to-day decisions that affect the universal rights of our individual countries' citizenry. We either do not respond, or we respond after the fact, or perhaps we respond according to our individual party political affiliations. We have to move away from being nervous and timid in addressing political decisions and policies, and be clear we are addressing the impact of the decisions. Next slide, please. The NPO's situation versus COVID-19 pandemic, it is a crisis. But this crisis has been coming and it has been ignored for some time. And it is perhaps largely thanks to the pandemic that we are now revisiting again the crisis that has befallen the sector for so many years before today. And it is also acknowledged by very many people and NPOs that a number of those estimated 233,900 something registered nonprofit organization that provides, you know, a wide range of services are now expecting, or are already in some cases experiencing cutbacks in donations and other sources of income, such as fees for implementing government programs and corporate social investment projects. And it has been regarded as, you know, shocking that the the financial relief package that was offered by the president has totally ignored the NPO sector in totality. The next slide. One of the other challenges, again, is the rise of the blue chip NPO, as Prof has just alluded to in the last presentation. And the focus on monitoring and evaluation has also influenced employment policies and cost. And NPOs are increasingly have to hire relevant specialists who demand higher salaries. The next slide, please. One of the last presentation by Prof also alluded to the current challenges in that one. I would move to the slide number 15 on the recommendations. If you can help me on that one, please. The slide on recommendations or conclusions. On the conclusions. Yes. We have a number of recommendations that we want to put forward, and one is investing in a new social entrepreneur funding approach, and also consider capital seed funding and also funding for staff and management training as important to building capacity. This will also increase capacity as well as capability, self-reliance and sustainability of the institution and individuals in that particular NPO. Let's also review the NPO Act and try and centralize and harmonize the system of registration and reporting. There are also other areas that also need to be relooked. Let's also review an NPO mandatory representation at NEDLEC. Representation must be through organized nonprofit sector and not individual networks. We must also provide for establishment of nonprofit council as a statutory independent body, improve and consolidate registration and reporting systems, provide for a national community-based response program for COVID-19, which can also be a national 5-year COVID-19 strategic plan, develop a new coordinated comprehensive cross-sector partnership program. And lastly, Minister, to establish a ministerial NPO task team that will seek to address all of above and others, including the planning of the social sector summit, which has not happened and which we actually want, and also an NPO session in Parliament, which will be about us and nothing without us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sithole, for sharing the perspectives from the nonprofit organizations that you represent. And I think these perspectives are essential, and the recommendations are something that need to be taken into serious consideration because you are the people working on the ground. I'm sorry to say that Minister Zulu doesn't seem to be available, so she won't be joining us today unless something unexpected happens, but I don't think so. So the next presentation is on community perspectives on civil society, and the presenter will be Mr. Thulani Chifuta, who is the overall coordinator of NEDLAC's community constituency. Mr. Chifuta, I'm handing over to you.
Well, good, is it still morning? Good afternoon, Program Director and all colleagues who are on the call, and thank you so much for this opportunity to make this brief reflection. We can go to the next slide, let's get into it. And in our acknowledgement, all protocols are being observed in the interest of time, so that we dedicate a lot of time into the substance of the discussion. Basically, we start this discussion by acknowledging that there are different roles and tags that are given to civil society, with others referring to it as the third sector. Anything that is not public sector and anything that is not private sector will then constitute that which is called the third sector, and many others, as you would know. But in the South African context, there is a further delineation of these sectors of society into four main social partners, which are primarily the leads in the platforms of social dialogue, even in South Africa. Those being government, being organized business, being organized labor, and structures of organized civil society under what is called the community constituency. And with all of these, at whichever angle you look at them, whether as the third sector or social partners, we believe that there are very distinctive but complementary roles that should be played by these social partners. Although there are certain things that can be done and done by government, there are equally things that can be done and done exceptionally well by the other social partners. When those things are done by their respective social partners, it should not mean they are competing, even if they are on the same domain. It means they should be complementing each other for increased impact of the benefit of those who are targeted as primary beneficiaries of those interventions. For example, there are programs, whichever way you look at them, if they are implemented by government, they will be suffocated by the bureaucracy and even get to be aborted even before they see the light of day. And those are best suited to be implemented by structures of civil society. We don't have to look very far for example of those programs. Just look on the type of community-based measures and interventions that were implemented under the COVID-19 regulations. You will then get to appreciate that there are things whose turnaround time requires that they be done by the agility of civil society. However much you may want to get them to be responsive and delivered quicker in communities, the bureaucracy is just gonna suffocate them. So that is the point that we're making with that point. And then therefore, capacity building becomes very essential for each of these social partners to be able to discharge their distinctive but complementary roles. And the point we're making here is that we may be seized with a discussion on the civil society today, but there is an acknowledgement that the capacity of the state is not where it should be for the state to be responsive to the challenges of society. Hence, in the NDP and in the medium-term strategic framework, you have a clear acknowledgement and articulation of an outcome which talks to the building of a capable, developmental, and an ethical state. And some of those capacities relate to the simplest of things that we keep reciting without full appreciation of what they mean. Practical example is, we always say South Africa has the best policies, but we lack translation of those into implementation through programs. And in capacity terms, that means we lack in the state or government capacity on program and project management and implementation. And so that capacity building is something that we must all be seized with in order for us to fulfill the roles and obligations of the distinctive but complementary roles that we talk about in the point above. Then there becomes another dynamic with regards to civil society, which dynamic plays itself by the phenomenon I call zonke bonke. How that phenomenon expresses itself is that you begin to have civil society organizations that do not stand for anything, but they sniff around for anything that has funding opportunities and you find them there. They look around for anyone who has funding opportunities and they define those as their friends. In that equation, the purpose becomes the essence of what is compromised, because you have civil society organizations that exist for anything and everything for anyone who provides funding opportunities. Hence, we cannot deny existence of organizations that will even go to an extent of saying any agenda that puts funds in our hands is an agenda that we are going to follow. And that is a very, very serious indictment in the dictum of capacity building, because with proper capacity, everyone will get to appreciate their value and role, and they will know what they exist to do. We can go into the next slide. With capacity building, we want to argue that there is a life cycle we have to take into consideration. That life cycle starts with potential, abilities, capacities, and capabilities. With potential, we must basically acknowledge that there are things which civil society could be doing, but not yet doing, but the sector on its own, individually and collectively, has the potential to can do those things. With abilities, it is an acknowledgement that there exist abilities within organizations and the sector as a whole to do certain things, like just a simple acknowledgement at an individual level, as an example, to say, I have the ability to run. When you translate that into capacities, you introduce quantified and qualified measures where you begin to say, I have capacity to run 100 meters within 2 minutes. And with capabilities, you take it a level higher, where you say, with an improved environment, which may include increased support of what other colleagues were talking about, we can be able to run 100 meters within 1 minute, and with less the energy that would have put if the necessary support measures were not there. And so we must look into capacities and capabilities with full appreciation of the abilities that already exist and the potential of what individual civil society organizations and collective could have in terms of their potential. And what are some of the challenges that we seek to address with capacity building? And with this capacity building, colleagues, we go and combine both capacities and capabilities. And we want to suggest that we use capacity building to address what everyone decries as weak civil society organizations. We are the first one to appreciate and acknowledge that there are weaknesses that exist within the sector. Secondly, we should use capacity building to address and improve the quality of the programs and the services that we provide as the sector. Thirdly, we should use capacity building for improved methods of doing things. The ways in which we do things can only be improved through capacity building. We should also leverage the benefits of capacity building to break away from the chains of perpetual and intercyclical dependency and build the sector and communities as centers of their own liberators, including economic activity. Capacity building, therefore, should focus on the areas that we're proposing below here, which should include governance and organizational development. We have forgone the role of building organizations, building sustainable organizations, building organizations that are sustained beyond the whims of the leadership that is in charge of those organizations at that time. Organizations tend to even be equated to individuals and personalities that are at the helm of those organizations. We do not see organizations as outliving the current crop of leadership that is existing in those organizations. And that is an indictment on us. And that must come with a conscious effort of seeking to build proper governance and institutional systems within our civil society organizations. Programs and services is another area of focus area of capacity building that we must not take for granted, because we must know what are the types of programs that whether government is sleeping, whether private sector is sleeping, but our society can count on civil society that whether there is a government or no government, we know that on these types of programs, we can count on civil society to make sure that it is providing those types of services to communities. And with those communities comes improved quality of services. And it means that when we position ourselves to provide programs and services, it means we must also boost our capacity on skills like program and project management, including implementation of those programs. Financial resources and financial capacity is one of the areas we cannot take for granted, because for us to do all the work that we need to do, we need those resources. And it is an area that we must not go easy on. It cannot be acceptable that with the multi-billions that are being spent in the South African society, both in the public sector and the private sector, the civil society is the one that gets to be compromised and relegated into beggars of the crumbs of what other sectors spend, not for the benefit of the leaders of civil society, not for the benefit of the organizations of civil society, but for the benefit of the implementation of programs by civil society that go to benefit communities. And so the biggest beneficiaries of the resources that are channeled through civil society is not the organizations themselves, is not the leaders of civil society, is not the employees of civil society, but communities that stand to benefit out of the work of civil society. And we also want to argue that this must be coupled together with technical skills development. And with this technical skills development, it is based on the acknowledgement that with these skills, we will acquire them in order for us to do our work better. We will acquire them in order for the areas of programs that we have defined ourselves, we are able to be meticulous in the delivery of those programs. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, 2 minutes. What are some of the cross-cutting capacity areas that we can look at? Research is one of those critical areas. We're actually very elated that NDA has worked with a Human Sciences Research Council in this intervention, so that civil society interventions are not seen as those that are cut out of on top of our heads, but we begin as a sector to drive evidence-based interventions. Monitoring and, or let me say, mainstreaming and institutionalization of monitoring and evaluation is going to boost our capacity significantly. There are services which should be shared services. Which services can be championed by NDA, like auditing services? There is always a competition in the minds of civil society. Should we use the limited resources we have to pay auditors when we can use this to drive our programs? And of course, the programs will take preponderance. So issues like auditing and compliance, where civil society organizations do not have those resources, institutions like the NDA must combine efforts and say, we will provide shared services that service all civil society organizations, such that you don't have to spend your own money in doing those, in paying for those services. So we argue that building capacities and capabilities is essential for self-reliance and sustainability. This self-reliance and sustainability is buttressed on what you can call asset-based community development approaches, which approaches appreciate that Whilst communities may have challenges, they equally hold solutions to those challenges. You don't start interventions in communities by saying, due to lack of, due to insufficient, due to absence of. You start by appreciating resources and assets that reside in those communities and only build from there in moving forward. We also argue that capacity building is an essential building block of participatory development approaches. And with these development approaches, we are of the view that there are already civil society organizations that provide programs and services in communities, whether they are registered or not, whether they are compliant or not. And so our capacity building interventions must not only focus on accredited training at the expense of empowering organizations to do that which they already do even better. Let's move into the next slide in my last minute. So where are some of these resources that we think we can basically get for capacity building? The resources that are allocated by DSD NPO Directorate are resources that must be ring-fenced to provide this capacity building. What is sitting in the national lotteries? We must argue that the Department of Social Development is failing civil society in reining the National Lotteries Commission in setting the agenda of what the national lotteries should be doing side by side with civil society. Yes, the National Lotteries Commission is an agency of Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, but its line function department in terms of policy is social development in terms of setting the agenda. We know there are billions that go through CSI from private sector and state-owned entities. There is no sector in South Africa that does not have a goal of providing capacity building into NGOs, into cooperatives, into SMMEs. Where are those resources that are targeted for NGOs going to? And we have donor agencies, foundations, and international sources. Capacity building is the one instrument that will deliver ownership, empowerment, and sustainability of interventions within the sector and communities. The NDA must host learning fora amongst civil society players that can get to share best practices and lessons of what is done on governance, on program implementation, and on capacity building. We should use capacity building to build structures of civil society that are fit for purpose. Our call and challenge is to the presidency, is to the Department of Social Development, is to NDA, to say all the issues that we have been discussing in the processes of the Presidential Social Sector Summit and the program we're defining to implement post the summit, including capacity building as one of the pillars, is a program we must be seized with, not only to discuss, but to get to implement. Program Director, thank you so much for the opportunity.
And thank you so much to you too for an impassioned presentation. And I see that there's a animated discussion on the chat, so it means that people are engaging with the presentations as they go. And we are sure to have a good open discussion at the end of the presentations. So last but not least, we need to hear the perspectives from the private sector. And Ms. Yani de Villiers from Agbiz and Busa will present to us these perspectives. I'm particularly interested to hear them because I taught her many moons ago at Nelson Mandela University. Over to you, Yani.
Thank you so much, Prof. And it was lovely seeing you today. And thank you so much to everyone for having me today and for allowing us to participate here. Now, I've been, as Prof explained, I represent BUSA. I'm actually with the Agricultural Business Chamber and was asked by BUSA to come and represent here today because I'm also the Deputy Chairperson of the Social Policy Committee. So in short, I wanted to explain where BUSA fits into the picture as a business entity. in that BUSA is the apex business representative body. So that means it's the only body representing business, organized business, within the NEDLAC structures. Now, this has been the case since 2003 when it was formed. It is also a confederation of business organizations. There's many different chambers of commerce and industry. It also has professional associations, corporate associations, and unisectoral associations like AGBIS, like the one that I belong to. Now, BUSA represents the views of members in a large number of national structures and bodies. These are both statutory bodies, National Minimum Wage Commission, to use an example, and non-statutory like NEDLAC, where Tulani is our colleague as well. Now, in 1994, and I always find it jarring to talk about 1994, given the fact that I was 11 years old at that time. So please, I know everybody here is so much more experienced, bear with me. But it brought a new era in terms of how we resolve political and workplace conflict. It is very sad to say that the challenges that we dealt with then are still the challenges we deal with today, and these are poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And that was illustrated so well by all the speakers before me as well. We acknowledge that social dialogue is the key instrument to address social and economic challenges. And it was so wonderful listening to everyone today who reiterated that and who said, the more we talk to each other, the more we are able to sort out our differences and our problems. Now, NEDLAC was established to promote and facilitate social dialogue. And it's also the vehicle where business, labor, and community organizations speak to each other and speak to government. Nowhere has it been more apparent than through the COVID-19 pandemic that if we actually sit around the table and we talk to each other, we can overcome enormous challenges and problems, as we have been doing basically nonstop since March. I think those of us engaging in the NEDLAC structures have seen more of each other over the last few months than we did in the 5 years preceding that. Now, the vision of NEDLAC is just to promote growth, equity, and participation through said social dialogue. And the mission is to give effect to the NEDLAC Act by ensuring effective public participation in the labour market and socioeconomic policy and legislation. And this also obviously to facilitate consensus and cooperation between the different parties, such as I've explained previously. Now, this is where NEDLAC's mandate is derived from. So this is basically the set of founding documents and the thing that we always need to refer back to, which is the NEDLAC Act, Labour Relations Act, the NEDLAC Founding Declaration, Constitution, the NEDLAC Constitution, and the NEDLAC protocols themselves. Now, in terms of the legal mandate, and please excuse me for taking you through each and every step this way, I'm passionate about engagement at NEDLAC, and I believe that the only way to solve our problems is to utilize the structures that are available to us, and we are unique. We are the only country that I'm aware of that has a tripartite plus structure, which is these tripartite social partners, but also community. Because at the end of the day, we are nothing but community members. Each and every one of us is still a community member, whether we sit there with our business hat on or our labor hat on. We all go back to a community at the end of the day. And the mandate of NEDLAC is to strive to promote the goals of economic growth, to reach consensus and conclude agreements. That's why we are there. We are not there to fight. We are there. We are supposed to find each other. We consider all proposed labour legislation relating to labour market policy before that is introduced in Parliament, again with the view of reaching consensus and reaching agreement. And we encourage and promote the formulation of coordinated policy on social and economic matters, and to, of course, resolve socioeconomic disputes. And these are the Section 77 disputes, as mentioned there. The governance structure, sorry, this is very, very small, but this is just to give you an indication of where exactly things happen. And as you can see there, BUSA is the business apex organization, And that is exactly the structures on the right-hand side of the slide where BUSA inputs in and has representation in. Now, how it works in terms of the business representation is BUSA has a social policy committee. It also has an economic policy committee and a few other policy committees which report to BUSA's board, and members are democratically elected to participate in different task teams as well as in the different structures of NEDLAC themselves, such as the chambers, management committee. I think that's it. Now, the process for policy engagement, I must say, it looks so lovely here. And then we think back at exactly what happened this year. And this entire slide was absolutely put on its head. And we engaged each other at all times of the night and over weekends to try and solve problems. But if things are normal and we're not in a situation such as we are at the moment with the pandemic, you normally get your policy proposals and legislation, and they are tabled at NEDLAC. A scoping exercise is done to figure out exactly in which area, functional area of NEDLAC this will be engaged in. If we look at policy proposals that have a very distinct developmental slant, they will go to the development chamber of NEDLAC, and that is where the community constituency, our colleagues, also sit with us. And then we basically engage on that piece of policy or legislation and speak to each other and have meetings with each other and see if we can improve on the document such as it stands there, which is our whole aim. We are trying to make it better and make it work for even more people. And once that process is finalized, there's a reporting process within the NEDLAC structure as well. All these agreements and perhaps disagreements are tabulated before the piece of policy or legislation is signed off on. Now, we have different work streams as well, and these are all things that BUSA are involved in. The first one is the Labour Market Chamber. I myself sit on the Labour Market Chamber, and that is where we look at everything labour related. Everything you can possibly imagine. A few of the focus areas such as your demarcations, your Decent Work Country program, which also has a community involvement and is very important. The labour market institutional trends, the engagements on different pieces of legislation, like I explained previously, and research. That's the wonderful thing about NEDLAC, is that all of us are still doing research or having research done at the end of the day. The Development Chamber, as I mentioned it, this is where the community constituency is also involved. We seek to reach consensus on matters pertaining to social and economic policy, but specifically your urban and rural implementation strategies and your development programs. Now, a few examples of these are the economic regulation of the Transport Bill, Transport Tribunal Amendment Bill, engagements on legislation, white paper on home affairs, the Basic Education Amendments, Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill, and the upgrading of land tenure rights amendment bill. I see there was conversation around social support in terms of all your different social development aspects. Had a task team in that regard as well that has been going for a few years. We have very strong community involvement. So that is also an aspect we are trying to find each other. The Trade and Industry Chamber. Now, this specifically looks at the economic and social dimensions of trade, as well as the different industrial inputs, your mining sector, agricultural sector, and different services policies and the associated institutions of delivery in those specific areas. Now, what they are currently looking at, or a few of their focus areas, there's the Technical Sectoral Liaison Committee, or the CELICO. That looks specifically at trade agreements, and this is also taken through the NEDLAC process. There's the Non-Agricultural Market Access, or NAMA, and the Non-Trade Barriers, NTB to trade, your technical infrastructure agencies, customs fraud and illegal imports, engagements on legislation. There's 3 bills that are currently underway in this particular industry, or this particular chamber. And then you also have an annual strategic session with the Minister of Trade and Industry. This is the last one, is the Public Finance and Monetary Policy Chamber. Now, some of their focus areas are engagements on the medium-term budget policy statements, engagements on the FinScope 2019 results, and engagements on the sugar tax for instance, that came in went through this particular chamber, and they also have different engagements on legislation, much like the other chambers have. Now, as my last slide, something that I wanted to talk about today with regard to what I've explained to you now. As you can see, it's a very involved process in our country, and rightfully so. These are important things and we need to engage them robustly. We have the structure. We actually have a wonderful structure in place for social dialogue, but I don't think we always utilize it completely. We definitely don't utilize it in the way that we can. And the other thing is, we tend to, when I say we, I include myself, business as a whole, and all the different social partners. We tend to engage at NEDLAC, and then we don't engage each other outside of the structures of NEDLAC, which is a missed opportunity, in my opinion. I think there is a lot more room for social dialogue outside of the traditional structures, problem solving, and trying to forge partnerships. The private sector is very focused on partnerships, and that is how we conduct our business, and that's also how we conduct development work at the end of the day. An example of this is that BUSA has an agreement with SAPCOA, which is the South African Business Coalition on Health and as well as HIV and AIDS. And what this is an entity of a committee of private companies who've decided that we need to look at health as a whole and HIV AIDS, not only to make our workplaces safer and healthier, but because we know that the people in our workplaces are members of communities, that this will have a positive impact at the end of the day on our communities as a whole. So there's definitely scope to start talking to each other and see how we can help each other and where can we connect, where are we actually duplicating work, where we can combine efforts, and where can we find each other in our day-to-day challenges. Because as much as I understand that this sector has challenges, business also has challenges. There's not a single sector who can sit here today and say that we have everything figured out. We know exactly what we want to do. We know exactly how things should be done. And it enriches all of our processes to engage with each other and to talk to each other. And I wanted to leave you with the thought that I said earlier, that we are all members of different communities. We might have a different hat at NEDLAC, and we might sometimes not see eye to eye, but we are all community members at the end of the day. So, Prof, I see I had a few questions here. I was just not sure, can I answer them now or do I leave them for the Q&A?
I think, Yanni, leave them for the Q&A because there are quite a number of questions that came before these. So we'll deal with them as they've been presented.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
It's a pleasure. It's good to see you again. Very proud of some of my former students. So we have actually, we're right on time where we should be for the discussion period, and we have a nice 45 minutes in which to discuss issues. And I'm just going to run through some of the questions that we have received and maybe some comments, and then I'm going to hand over to the panelists to answer. So some of the comments that have come through are around accessibility. How do people get hold of people who get things done? And there seems to be a little bit of a level of frustration around accessibility and responsiveness. So perhaps we could have a general discussion about that as the panel. I'm going to go through 3 questions and hand over to you, or comments that are relevant. There's another question that was posed, and it is, how does an official check whether the MPO is compliant in terms of the NPR Act? So that's a very specific question. Sorry, my alarm to say that Yanni should stop talking. Sorry about that. And we also have, sorry, there's discussion and questions in amongst the discussions. The next question I think is a very important one, and that is that social assistance is important, but how do we prevent dependence and a bigger lack of coping skills of vulnerable people? And that question was posed by Krista Klink. So does anybody on the panel, if you want to answer any of those questions, please just switch on your camera and your microphone, and can have some discussion.
I'm here. No, thanks very much. There's a question that have been asked in terms of how one do you check whether the NPO is compliant. Currently, there's two systems, there's two approaches on how one need to check whether you're compliant or not. Initially, in terms of Section 18 and the Section 21 of the NPO Act, if an NPO is not compliant over a period of a year, the department have to deregister that NPO, or they need to cancel its registration and notify on the website that it is cancelled. But currently we have suspended that due to the public outcry that we have, meaning that if you want to check now whether you comply, you go to the www.dsd.npo.za, and then you look under the NPO, and then you check the NPOs. It will return there. You comply or you don't comply. You can see that. But starting from the 1st of April, we will be deregistering all 63% of the NPOs that are not complying. There will be public outcry, but this time we are ready on how to deal with those, because we are going to use different approaches that we have. Second question, I can attempt to answer on the dependency. If you have heard what Tulani have mentioned, I don't think there is any dependency that the civil society will develop or have developed. If you look at the poverty in the country and where we come from, we haven't done much to empower the civil society in the country. Not necessarily as government, business, and donors. We haven't done much. The funding of the sector still runs in different categories. The earlier civil society, especially NPOs that were empowered, are still the one benefiting even currently. We have seen from where I sit a lot of advent of the new NPOs that are registered, and those remains poor, those remains needy, those remains the ones that are not capacitated, neither funded, nor receive any grant from any. We haven't reached a stage of dependency as such. We still need to do a lot to be able to cover even 25% of the newly registered NPOs that we have in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any other comments from other panelists with regards to the questions posed?
Yes, if I can come in, it's Diane from Sasa.
Yes, sure, Diane.
Oh, sorry, I had switched off the camera, my apologies. Just to say that around the question of dependency within the social assistance environment, I think one of the very big challenges that we're really looking at now and working with a number of external partners is to see how we're able to not take people out of the social assistance, because I think that's the wrong perception, but how do we provide opportunities for people to be able to exit the social assistance program? You can't expect people to exit give up social assistance when there isn't other opportunities. But if there were opportunities, how do we then prepare them for making the most of those opportunities? And that takes a lot of effort from a number of people, so that the social assistance is not just an issue of creating dependency. It really is providing income support for people who there is no other alternative at this stage. But we need to start looking, and when we look at how we can link people who are in the program to other opportunities, we're looking specifically at the caregivers of the children. Remember, I had said that the areas that we focus on are older people, people with disabilities, and children. Now, those, for whatever reason, those categories need to continue receiving the support. However, the caregivers of the children are a category that we can focus on to see how we're able to link them to other programs. And this requires a whole of government and civil society response, not just a SASA response. So certainly is being discussed. It does become even more challenging if it is seen against the backdrop that we have currently of the very high and increasing unemployment rate. However, it very definitely is high on the agenda and something that we will continue to pursue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diane. Any other responses to the questions posed from panelists? You can just introduce. Yes.
Look, I just want to add on what Diana has just said. I think one of the things that we need to look at is not just a question of how do we get people on dependency on SASA, but I think the question is how do we create sustainable economic activities at community level, which are driven by the potential and the abilities and the capabilities which the presentation has spoken about. We have a huge unemployment rate in the country. We have a huge younger population that doesn't have the skills to make a sustainable living with what they know to do best. Now, we've got to actually put all efforts to build that kind of capacity at community level, because remember, these are individuals, but you need to harness those skills so that people are not just looking at employment, but they're looking at making a livelihood with the abilities that they are having. I think then that will actually relieve the high burden that we see in the social security system. And is an effort which has to be driven from a policy level. And it must be an intentional policy to deal with the high level of people that end up being defined as dependents. And I think everybody can contribute in building those capabilities at a community level. And the civil society sector, I think, is the right sector to tackle that area. I think is the right sector to tackle building people's capabilities to sustain themselves. We tend to want to rely that government must give subsidies, but let's focus on building this sector to actually deal with that problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bongani. Any other comments? You can just switch on your video. Okay. So it appears that we can move on to the next question. It's a comment and some related questions. So the comment is that CBOs are seen as the Cinderellas of development because of their capacity constraints, but they are the very organizations that are at the coalface of all the issues of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. sorry, I'm gonna switch my camera on. So instead of enforcing training that is not suited to them, different programs must be developed that works to their strengths and not their weaknesses. I think this is an important point that can be addressed. The second point is that language is a major barrier because everything is conducted in English. So I'm not sure if that's referring to the dialogue or to what happens on the ground. And lastly, that accredited training programs does not mean that they are always the best programs. So there's some interesting points raised there. And I was wondering if the panelists could address these issues.
Maybe to start, Prof, I think is a chicken and egg situation. I think we always want to think that capacity building is going to a formal, structured, English design system, then you will have capacity. I think to build capacity, you actually have to acknowledge in the first instance that human beings have got an ability to survive. And they use different mechanisms to survive. How do we best build and harness those survival mechanisms that people are inherently having in a manner within which is acceptable, understandable, and it makes sense to them? That's the first instance. The second instance is, how do you create an environment that is conducive for them to maximize what they know and what they understand and what they do? That's another segment of capacity building. Just creating that environment. The environment has got many areas around it. And thirdly, how do you incentivize those people, which then becomes beneficial to them, and they can see the tangible benefit that they actually rip up out of it? You now have a pipeline of capacity building that's close to complete for somebody to actually not see the civil society organization or the NPOs or whatsoever word we will use as vehicles that need to be taught how to do something. But you see them as vehicles that initiates, and given the space and given the environment within which they can do things better and provide the systems and the processes to support them for purposes of compliance and purposes of accountability and all the other things. I think that's the point that we have to cage capacities and capabilities on. Thank you.
Thank you again, Bongani, for that intervention.
Can I come in?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I wanted to indicate the genesis of our discussion and the policy perspective on where is this hinged upon. If we look at Chapter 2 of the NPR Act, it prescribed very well that within the limit prescribed by law, every organ of the state must determine and coordinate the implementation of its policies and measures in a manner designed to promote, to support, and enhance the capacity of non-profit organizations to perform their functions. What it means is that every organ of the state, including entities, need to look at which non-profit organizations belong to their sector. For example, agriculture for that matter. It has got to make sure that it promote, it support, and enhance the capacities of all those civil society and NPOs that work on agriculture. And I think if you look at several speakers, despite describing the how and the when part of it, we need then to ensure that the non-profit organizations are capacitated. I think Tulani mentioned a portion of the budget that the government has needs to go towards ensuring that they promote and they support and enhance the capacity of the non-profit organization. Therefore, we are mandated to provide that to the non-profit sector. And by capacity, I think scholars will define it in different ways, but you need to enable them to be able to deal with the issue at a community level and do their work appropriately. And that is something that we are supposed to do. I won't mention what we have done, but I will say the law prescribes us as government and the sector, including the donors and the private sector, need to deal with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that intervention. So the next, did somebody want to say something? Is that Barua?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Just briefly to say that as we have remarked that these civil society organizations have different roles to play, and therefore they should not be intervened with solutions which are one size fits all. So training or capacity building cannot just be, it should be tailored to respond to their needs. So they need to identify their training needs so that it tailored around there, but also to acknowledge that coaching and mentorship support need to be emphasized, because is an ongoing, process that is running through. It's not an event moment where this capacity building happens and it ends there. So it needs to run through. But it is also important to not to rule out accreditation. I keep on hearing this. Of course, I do understand that it is not necessarily the best, but it should be part of the hybrid, because it plays also important part of skilling, having professional service providers or programs that are running in the universities, in other FETs and all of that. And that need to also be appreciated, not be overruled. Although I do understand it's not the best approach as it is.
Thank you very much, Barua. I think that is something that came through from our research and the whole issue of tailor making. Yes, go ahead.
Program Director, can I jump in and comment on an earlier issue of compliance? And mention the fact that we are looking at compliance from the point of DSD requirements. Compliance is much more broader than that. There are other elements that builds into being compliant. In terms of registration, that also gives effect to the fact that there are a number of registrations that NPOs have to go through. And in all those registration requirements, there is also issues of compliance. And One of them is also with regard to SARS, where you have to be compliant with. And the Alliance of NPO Networks has been working on a program or a project that would assist its members or any other NPOs that is confronted with this kind of a challenge. And we hope that that kind of a program will assist the NPOs as well as ensuring that we cut at the end of the day the number of those NPOs that will be deregistered at the end of the day. And we have partnered with a strategic partner with SAIBA, and SAIBA is the Southern African Institute of Business Accountants. And they'll be coming with us on the ground to identify NPOs who are facing these challenges and to help them with compiling their reports, the annual reports, the financial statements, the audits, and also, with regard to your PBO status, your tax matters, and ensure that you submit these at the end of the day. And I think that kind of an approach, if we bring in DSD in, is a kind of the partnership that we are also talking about, from the point of ensuring that we work hand in hand and we collaborate on matters that affects the NPO sector. And I also want to talk on the issue of preventing dependency. To say that in our presentation, we mentioned the fact that in our planning processes, we need to also look at ensuring that we include our beneficiaries as a package where we need to be addressing our efforts in terms of capacity building and capability. But with regard to dependency, you cannot divorce the issue of needs and the question of dependency from each other. They coexist, but one at a time will always be at the upper level than the other one. But what we are sensing now, there is a need out there from communities of social relief, and government has come forward and offered what they can be able to offer at this stage. But of course, it is important that we do not continue to do that without also encouraging people to start their own businesses. But what is important is that we need, the corporate sector, we need business to also come in and work with us as the NPOs to ensure that we can together promote the idea of creating wealth away from, just sitting at home and not doing nothing. So it is important that the aspect of dependency must not be looked at entirely on its own. It must be looked at with regard to issues that also surround issues of needs. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you, Chipa. We have a question that's directed to Busa specifically. So that is, can Busa explain to the participants about the fact that community constituencies excluded from some of the NEDLAC chambers, and maybe explain the reasons for that? So I think that was the question you were referring to, Yanni.
Thank you very much. And before I answer the question, I just wanted to respond to what Mr. Sitole was saying, and to agree with him, and to say that that's what I meant. I think we need to start connecting the dots, and we need to see where we can channel spending in terms of corporate social responsibility and whatever else it might be to causes that connect, that have these kinds of effects the way that you described them. Now, to answer the NEDLAC question, I'm going to try to the best of my ability, given the fact I also have only been involved in NEDLAC for about 3 years. The situation currently at NEDLAC is the NEDLAC is governed by an act, the NEDLAC Act, and also by the NEDLAC Constitution. And both of these prescribe very specific constituencies, and they mirror the constituencies as they are at the International Labour Organization, which is government, employers, and employees in the way of organized labor. Now, in South Africa, the expansion has been made to make it tripartite plus, which includes community. Community is in a specific chamber, which is the development chamber. But I must also say that aside from the fact that it is true, a community isn't in every single chamber. Strides have been made to change this as well. If we look at a structure such as the National Minimum Wage Commission, we have 3 community commissioners on there. Who are fully fledged commissioners, the same as any of the other commissioners, and who make very real impacts in terms of wages in this country, which is traditionally regarded as something that is reserved for the tripartite structure to discuss, if you look at the way that the ILO is structured. So I think in ways we are moving past that, but in other ways we are still in this situation, and the NEDLAC Constitution can only be changed through consensus. So all the different social partners need to decide and agree to change it and to allow a specific constituency into more chambers. So it's not a question of one entity holding out another entity. There is a process. But honestly, I want to come back to the point that I made, that this is the situation. We don't know what the next 5 years hold in for any of us. And we can't sit around and wait for things to change on a NEDLAC level. We have to engage each other outside of NEDLAC as well. COVID has provided us with an incredible opportunity to do that. And I hope that once this pandemic leaves us, as we know it will, we will get to that point, that we don't lose this energy and that we don't lose the will to try and solve problems. And that if we have to solve these problems around a table wherever it is, that we do that and we not just wait for NEDLAC. Thank you very much, both.
Thank you, Yanni, for that response. The next question that deals with an interesting topic is one posted by David, and it's about corruption. So South Africa suffers from endemic corruption throughout, and that would include in the civil society sector. So he wants to know who is policing trends of illicit finance flows channeled through churches and family inheritance trusts, etc. So there is a problem. It happened during COVID, that money wasn't spent on what it was meant to be spent on. So I think it would be interesting to hear from the community or civil society organizations about this issue.
Can I start from government?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, from government, in terms of the sector, remember we monitor the NPO's activities through their submission of reports and through any other things that comes to the NPO. We work with the law enforcement agencies, the FIC, SAPS, HAWKS, and NPA. In terms of the illicit, what we normally pick up, which is not in the radar of everyone, is the issue where there is terrorist funding, where the NGOs, about 50 NPOs, were surveilled and were found to be receiving money. I won't say exactly from where, but receiving money from somewhere. And the FIC plus the HAWKS and the SAPS picked this up. The FIC put a radar on activities of money that flows from either from bank to NPOs, from NPOs to banks, or from overseas to anywhere, where they monitor and they pick that in terms of anti-terrorism and anti-money laundering. An example is during the COVID, there was media releases and through the social network that you need to change your NPO to NGOs. Once you change, you will get 2 million or whatever. We reported that. Once we got that, we issued media statement. We reported that to those surveillances on the security. Then they picked up few NPOs. Anti-terrorist is about 50 NPOs that are now been caught. In terms of the COVID, we have a sizable number, I think between 12 and 15 NPOs that fraudulently, some people here in Johannesburg and Pretoria were doing it in all 9 provinces. Money were running through that. Some people has been got. Some have been arrested. Some is still silently because they are assisted by some people in other offices. So we do that silently in terms of the government and the sector. By the way, we distinguish the civil society is a broad term. I'm talking about NPOs that are registered with us and that are registered in the department. But others, I think civil society include cooperatives and SMMEs. For that, I don't know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's hear from partners. Perspectives.
Program Director.
Yes.
The issue of corruption within the sector, if I may say so, it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge because it happens in isolation, away from our prodding eyes. It happens sometimes right under our nose without any suspect. But it is happening, and I believe that from experience, what we have seen happening, and this is an issue that I think government and other civil society actors are also acknowledging, is the fact that we do have professionals that are also involved to some degree. And what is also important is the problem of not reporting any misuse or maladministration or any corruption activities that takes place, and that could be, be found during the process of auditing. If we were to go back to a lot of corruptions that has just taken place now, some happens immediately as the money arrives. So there's no issue of bringing in any other outsiders there. But what happens is when the money has been received and an audit process is done, and there is no report or there is no reference to any malpractices that could be seen as corruption. So at the end of the day, we also need to be talking to our professional bodies to say that they need to play their part as well. We are not privy to what is happening in any other organization. From where I'm sitting, I have no clue to the reports that are received by social development. And even in that space, DSD is also incapacitated when it comes to ensuring that the larger public has access
to what is happening financially with the NGOs that are reported there, because there is also a need, and I'm sure the Act provides for that, that the information or the reports that are submitted to DSD in this instance, they must also be accessed by the public. The public must have access to that particular kind of information so that they are able, if not to stop, but to assist and help DSD and government at large to ensure that we stop, corruption at its roots. So my other thinking, program director, is to look at the DSD situation in the case and say that yes, they have their work cut out by the number of the NGOs that are happening, by the pandemic, the money, the huge billions that were also involved in mitigating COVID-19, and that opens up the fragility of the NPOs, in that people came in and registered for very awkward reasons, and there is no way that the DSD can see people coming to register for reasons that are not fair or to the cost. So that is another way of saying that perhaps DSD can also increase its capacity on its own to ensure that it can detect any untoward registration by individuals as NPOs, and also to look at how they can, make sure that the reports, and not only the financial report, but all reports that are submitted by NGOs we are able to access them at the end of the day. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Chippa. We have someone who wants to address some of the issues that have been raised. It's Mr. Jimmy Gojana, who is the National Convener for NPO Networks. So I'm going to hand over to you, Mr. Gojana.
Yeah, thank you very much, Program Director, Professor Mula. I must say that indeed, this is a great opportunity presented to the civil society in the country. As you know, that civil society under severe constraints due to COVID. But I must commend NDA and yourself, Human Research Science Council, for taking up this very exciting program, a program that has to assist the civil society in the country. You see, when I was listening to all issues that were presented, I think coming up from the opening remarks and welcoming by Professor Soudin, and I think it's true what Professor Soudin was saying, that the issue of demobilization of the masses from being party or playing a critical role in the development trajectory in the country is something that we need to seriously look at, very, very, very seriously. But again, when I was listening to all the conversation, the dialogues, a lot of critical inputs that came out from the panelists, and I was of the view that really there's something that we need to do in the country, okay? Because I think to some extent, the issue of the NPO capacities and capabilities is not only the only issue that affects the sector. There are a myriad of other issues that I think should be looked at within the context of ensuring that we build the sector. Because critically, it's important that the government must view the civil society sector as a critical stakeholder, as a serious partner in the development of the country. We are partners, Professor Mula, in this initiative. So it therefore means that, and that opportunity wherein the Presidential Social Summit, Social Sector Summit was collapsed or was not made possible, we need to revive. We need to rescind that decision. In actual fact, I'm here challenging Minister Zulu, in particular, and NTA, to take a lead in this process. Because I think those are the two critical, components that can drive this agenda. Because if we cannot talk of, NPO capacities and capabilities as, we view that as a piecemeal, a fragmented, a way of doing things. There's the issue of transformation of the sector. There's the issue of an appropriate, funding model for the sector. There are various other issues that are confronting the sector. And I think that Presidential Social Sector Summit was an ideal platform that could look into. So I'm posing a challenge, to social development, and I'm glad that the acting DG is here, the DDG Peter Nchipale, the NDA CEO, and various other people, critical, within the sector that I see that are here. Let's come back. Let the president come up again and address the nation, because it is the only, significant social summit. It's the only summit that the president never convened. All other summits went ahead, but this one critical. And now we're hearing good reports coming from, HSRC, NTA, and tomorrow, next year will be other reports. So we need a really, to come up with a very consolidated national position that will address all the issues that are challenging the sector. So I'm here appealing for the same energy, for the same cohesive strategy that was created by NTA. Let's look into that and let's ensure that let's do it so that we build the sector. The sector is yearning to partner government, and government cannot do anything in this country without us. Please, let's work on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy, for that impassioned presentation. And I'm quite sure that the Minister is going to be receiving all this information from her senior officials. So for those of you who are not pleased that the Minister was not able to make it, you are still speaking to decision makers. And that was something that Jimmy brought up. In terms of the myriad of problems that the sector faces, I don't know if Professor Kanyane just wants to talk again about the other two projects that we are wrapping up with the National Development Agency.
Yeah, maybe before he talks, right? A program moderator. You remember I said at the beginning there are 4 areas of this dialogue. This is the first one. And we've got 3 other streams which will deal with the regulatory mechanism, deal with the funding of the sector, and deal with the transformation. That will give the pipeline that was raised from the initial research that we did. So some of the comments that are coming, I think the issue is we've got to connect all of these dots so that as a sector, because in many cases is government or as government agencies would want to speak on behalf of the sector. The dialogues are for igniting the entire sector to take a policy view on how the sector would want the states, which is the government, which has got government and the private sector, to engage with the sector on both issues of policy, legislation, and operation. so that they can actually take their rightful seat in this democratic state and take them back where they were as a respectable sector that has got a responsibility and an accountability requirement for development in the country. I just want to raise just only those two. There are three that are actually going to be connected.
Thank you very much. I think that's covered what Professor Kanyanya would have said, that there will be two other reports and policy briefs, at least from the HSRC, dealing with the regulatory framework and the transformation issues. It's of course very difficult to separate these issues, but today's discussion is really about capacity and capabilities. So those are the kinds of issues that we wanted to focus on. And I think that there have been some interesting questions posed around this. Now, I'm very aware of the time and that we have very little time left before we must wrap up at 2 o'clock. It's been a long day, but I just want to see if there are any people who want to raise their hands and pose questions now. I'll take 3 questions, short ones. Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands. So what I'm going to do now is, if the panelists want to add anything to what has been said, yeah, so yes, Barua?
There is someone who raised their hand, Fundo.
Okay, I can't see it from my side. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Prof, for the opportunity given. I've been listening from the beginning of all the presentations. And I must say thank you to all the panelists who have enlightened us with so much information. I just have one question, which I think it will be more enlightening to me. I think it goes to Mr. Nchipale, if I pronounce that correctly, in relation to the registration of the NPO, NPC, and the trust. Sometimes you find it very confusing. I'm an M&E specialist. You find it very confusing when you are on site assessing these documents, and you find that the organization is registered as a trust, as an NPO, as an NPC. But then it becomes a discretion of an organization that you are assessing as a specialist to decide what it would like to operate as. I'll make an example. Then the organization will be funded by DSD in terms of the NPO 1998. But when you get on site and you begin to see the compliance of that, you won't really see it because it operates as a trust. So it becomes a whole lot of confusion, and I was hoping that Mr. Nchipale would enlighten me in this one, because it's a matter that I have been struggling to get around it. It poses a lot of risks, because then as DSD you fund this organization as NPO, but its operations are that of a trust in nature and in practice. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. So there can be a response. There's a question directed to Peter.
Yes, let me respond to the question. Registration as an NPO is in relation to the NPO Act, which prescribe how an NPO need to behave and it need to practice in the outside world. There are many reasons why trust want to register as an NPO, or NPC want to register as an NPO. And that reasons is relates to that trust will operate as a public benefit organization. In other words, immediately she registers with the Department of Social Development and get an NPO status. It then goes and register with SARS under Section 18A of the SARS, so that it can get a public benefit status that prohibit them from paying tax or to be subjected to the tax regulations. And mostly that's how it works. Now let's go to the next step in terms of the compliance. Compliance varies in terms of complying to what? If a trust registered with us and it becomes it's a trust which has got a public benefit status by registering with non-profit organization, and it goes to a department to be funded, it cannot be funded as a trust. It is funded as an NPO. Therefore, the people that are funding will have made the specification to say this non-profit organization need to be funded by, for you to be funded by government, you must be an NPO. If you are a trust, then you have, if you are funded as a trust, so you won't use the NPO certificate per se. You will be using your trust deeds and certificate in terms of that. But you will be subjected to tax, even the VAT, if you are funding on that. But if you use an NPO status, you will not be charged VAT, or you are not going to, or whatever you have, you will not be able to be taxed. The other aspect of it is that as an NPO, if you access funds from anywhere, the remaining funds cannot be shared amongst its members if you use an NPO certificate to be funded. You cannot divide, there's no dividend as an NPO. It says the proceeds of the NPOs must be used for service delivery of what you have been funded for. This applies also in terms of the NPC. A lot of NPC comes here because if you're a non-profit company, you go there, you get funding from whatever, you must pay tax. And you must do, you are managed in terms of the Companies Act. But once you register as an NPO, then you use an NPO for monitoring in terms of after you have done your statements and your tax returns, it will indicate as an NPO. They will be watching it, that you can use that. So it is only the understanding of the people that funds or the people that provide monitoring or that manage that institution, whether this institution is being funded as what. And that is very clear in terms of that. If it's funded as an NPO, therefore the approach in which they need to be managed, it must be in line with an NPO Act. But if you need others, I will offer my number so that we can discuss that. Maybe there are specific areas that you want us to go in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's 3 hands and we are very, very close to having to finish with this. So I want the questions to please be, well, only 2 hands now, to please be as short as possible, and also the responses. And please make your question pose it to specific panelists, because that would be easier. So I'm going to ask Judith, number 1, David, number 2, and Zakaria, number 3, to ask your questions, where after the panelists will wrap up.
Okay, thank you, Professor Miller. But I don't know who to pose this question to. It's just about succession after this dialogue. You know, as an organization now, we feel so invigorated, and we feel so that we are being taken into consideration again as civil society and awarded that place that we can play, that role that we can play, that came out as so important during all the discussions and all the recommendations that were made for the way forward. So I was wondering whether there would be another dialogue, or when that would be, or how we would then be, how will we keep keep updated with the progress of these recommendations that were made. So I'm not quite sure who to pose that question to.
All right, could we have the question from David, please? Do you still want to pose your question? I see you're muted.
Oh, thank you very much, Prof. Okay, my question is regarding to the government. So I would like to understand, since it's the end of the tenure of the United Nations Security Council this year. So hence now with the high profiling of high-level individuals engaging in corruption, I would like to know now what the government think how will be perceived by the international eyes in terms of consideration of next receiving those FDIs and donors again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Judith. I'm going to hand over to the panel for answers, and then we need to wrap up, please.
Mr. Nechipare, I think the question, the last question, I don't think it's for this forum. I think it's for the security cluster to provide that answer, because some of the things are not done by the social cluster, but are done by the security cluster.
Thank you. And I suppose I can address the issue about keeping people up to date about what is happening. I mean, the report and the policy brief will be available on both our websites, NDA and HSRC, after this dialogue. So you'll have a proper scrutiny of them. And then we will have further dialogues, as has been indicated. And all the people in this dialogue will be invited to the other dialogues. So sorry to rush, but it's time for us to wrap up and to hear from the last speaker on the program, and that's Ms. Zama Ndlovu, who is the board chairperson of the NDA. So I'm going to hand over to you, Ms. Ndlovu.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank the Honorable Minister of the Department of Social Development, Lindiwe Zulu, for her support, the Acting DG of the Department, Linton Kunu, the CEO of the NDA, Ms. Tamu Mzobe, and a special thanks to the Human Sciences Research Council for their involvement and partnership in this important dialogue. First, I'd like to agree that in reconstructing and reprioritizing the country's post-1994 agenda, we neglected to focus on the development and support of civil society organizations. It was not feasible to eradicate poverty and address all social ills without government's deliberate intervention in the form of policy, structures, and entities such as the NDA. The NDA was established in 1998 through its enabling legislation, the National Development Act, to specifically provide funding and developmental support to the civil society organizations. As a member of the board of the NDA, we are constantly mindful of this legislative mandate and have ensured through our committees that funding that is managed is dispersed efficiently and effectively to deserving CSOs. In achieving the above, we've noted areas where more can be done to ensure the successful fulfillment of our mandate. I therefore wish to agree with the CEO of the NDA, where she identifies CSOs' resource mobilization and sustainability as a key area for improvement. Though we've managed to capacitate and fund CSOs, there's still a lot to do with enhancing their leadership and management skills to grow their organization and think outside the box. Social dialogues are critical, but civil society cannot achieve its objectives on dialogue alone. The COVID-19 pandemic reveals starkly the negative impact of underinvestment in social development. Inadequate information and inadequate networks, as well as geographical inequalities, disadvantage CSOs that are closest to the most vulnerable because they are far from the resources. We have some tough questions we need to ask ourselves about how some legislative imperatives have resulted in resources flowing to communities that are closer to economic activities to the detriment of those which are not. Dependency is the only result when people are stuck in communities with no access to socioeconomic assets. To empower them, we need communicative and technological resources, especially in the wake of the pandemic. There is talk of a new world where we as government and research institutions cannot leave CSOs behind as we make plans towards digitization and economic emancipation for poor communities. The comments made by Diane of Sasa around the volunteers program are true in that we need to pay them a dignified stipend to enable them to provide for their families, significantly so. In prioritizing our budget, the board has also paid special attention to increasing budgets towards funding CSOs and this specific project. I'd like to thank everyone who has taken the time to organize and participate in the session, and all of the questions which were posed by the attendees are questions we really need to think about in more detail. Let this not be the last conversation of this kind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. I see my camera has been stopped, but I think that we're close to being cut off. So I would ask everybody to follow up on your questions. We have the questions online. There we go. We have the questions online. We will save the questions and then there could be follow-ups to those questions, hopefully, that are a little bit more specific, such as the one that Maureen posed to Sasa. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I would like to thank everyone who participated, the panelists, as well as the audience, for your comments, for your interaction. And we do hope that you've learned a lot and are going to learn more as we go. And the HSRC is very pleased to be working with the National Development Agency to make this happen. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Prof. And bye.
Thanks.
Thank you
bye.
very much, Prof.
Keep well.
Next to each other here. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.